What's up guys, Doug here. So a while back we had a windstorm and this happened, which turned into this and this. Obviously, most of this fallen tree is being used as fuel for the fire pit, but I thought it would be cool to take some of the wood and make a table. And here it is, the final product. So I wanted to take a moment and share with you exactly how I took a few pieces of this fallen tree and turned it into the epoxy resin table that you just saw. After cutting a couple of the logs into about 2-inch slabs, I needed to start by making sure that both sides of those slabs were flat and that the overall thickness of the slabs were approximately identical. And I did this using a homemade planing jig and a router. Next, I measured the overall dimensions that I needed for the table, and I built a mold using 3/4 inch melamine board, which the epoxy resin won't actually adhere to as it cures. I fit the slabs into place in the mold that I made, and I cut straight edges on some of the pieces that were going to fit in the corners and on the sides of the table. I considered the next part to be the most fun of this project, which was actually pouring the epoxy resin into the mold. Just as a FYI, the wood will actually float on top of the epoxy resin. So I ended up using some small weights from my gym to hold the wood slabs down and in place while the epoxy resin cured. One mistake that I did make was not realizing that the wood would absorb a significant amount of the epoxy resin as it cured. And after several hours, the overall thickness had dropped to about half of what it was when I had first poured the epoxy resin. So I did end up having to pour a second layer, which was unplanned. But for my next project, I'm going to try mixing up a small portion of the epoxy resin and hand brush it onto all sides of the wood pieces and let that cure before the final pour. Hopefully that will keep the wood from absorbing so much of the epoxy resin as it sits. So once the second pour was fully cured, it was time to remove the tabletop from the mold, and I placed it back into the planing rig and used my router once again to remove the excess epoxy from the top of the table. Then the most time-consuming part, which was the sanding. And I started with 60 grit and I worked up to 320 grit in small increments to ensure that I got a super smooth finish. Finally, I used a oil-based polyurethane to seal the tabletop as well as give it that nice glossy finish. Once again, here is the final product. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if maybe you have some suggestions for my next project.